This panel, I think, was set up really, really nicely by Stephen's talk and by the conversations that have come before about the what and the how. And here we are talking about the where. I want to apologize in advance because the prior two panels were led by professional journalists. And when I put my hand up to do a panel, I did not realize that that would be the case. So from Kimberly's, perfectly timed, probing follow-up question and David's encyclopedic knowledge of the industry, you kind of get a little more of a, an inclusive, homegrown feel here from me. But this is something that really matters to me, and hopefully that'll come through. And we've got an amazing panel here of people to talk about doing place-based work. And I'll intro very briefly. Why does place work matter to Prudential? You've heard some about that, and those of you who know something about Prudential know that our history in Newark is really core to the way that the company sees itself and the way that the Impact Investments Group has always seen what we do. As a firm, we've put well over $1 billion into the city of Newark. We've invested in its schools, we've invested in jobs, we've invested in housing, both affordable and market rate. We've invested in its parks. We have really done everything we could as a firm to try to both catalyze economic opportunity through growth and make sure that those most likely to be left out and most historically left out could be included in that. Newark had its peak population in 1930 at close to 450,000 people, and that declined to about 270,000 people by 2000. The 20th century for Newark, like a lot of other cities, was a period of segregation and white flight and intentionally discriminatory economic policies that really left a lot of the citizens there behind. Through it all, Prudential remained, and through our work, what we're trying to do is help the city see a different future, a future that feels better, that brings more people to the table, and that undoes some of the harms of the past. And that's why we wanted to have a panel here to talk to three experts and three people whose work and passion for place really has led what they do professionally. And so I'm going to just jump right in here. Jim, I'll start with you. Jim Shelton is the Chief Investment and Impact Officer at Blue Meridian, which is doing a lot of different things, but one of the things that they're doing is pursuing a regional investment strategy, a regionally focused investment strategy. And Jim, could you just talk about why an organization would care to do that, why it would choose to use its resources in that way, focused in some very specific targeted places?
Sure. I mean, the reality is that our broad aspiration is to improve economic and social mobility nationally. But if you just take some certain things into consideration, you don't really have a choice if you want to see that happen, but to focus locally. Everyone by now is very familiar with Raj Chetty's data that shows what has happened with mobility over the last half century, where the likelihood of actually doing better than your parents, basically the American dream, has dropped from over 90% to about a 50-50 chance in the 1980s, looking like it's still on the decline. That opportunity is actually not only differentiated by region, but it's differentiated at the hyper-local neighborhood level. So you can look at a city map and see differences in mobility from one neighborhood to the next. This is not any surprise to anyone who actually has lived in an underserved neighborhood, but the reality is that our strategies have not recognized this and how you actually create opportunity. Now, there are two ways that you create opportunity. One is by actually investing in the kinds of pathways and opportunities that people need to improve individually. The second is that the biggest thing that determines your actual chances of being upwardly movable are where you live and who your parents are. Now, I'll translate that into your context. And so if you want to see people be upwardly mobile, you have to not only invest in them, you have to invest in their context. And the way you do that in a systematic way is locally. And I'll just say one more thing and then I'll be quiet. There's a bunch of different research that talks about how you actually get people, especially people who have been in poverty, to be able to escape poverty. And it basically says 20 years without a mistake, right? Get it right, even though you're poor, in terms of going to school and being ready, in terms of getting a third grade and being able to read, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way that that is likely to happen is if you can get a set of supports and their family and everything lined up in a way that you can compound the benefits of the good thing that happened before. So it doesn't matter. Actually, let me just really quickly. How many of you are parents? Okay, how many of you thought if you got nailed preschool, you were done? Right? But like, we talk about like Head Start, oh my God, it has fade out effects. All that means is, if you go to a great preschool and then you go to a sucky elementary school, it doesn't stick around, right? So you have to be able to compound those benefits over and over again, which means you have to align them in people's neighborhoods and the places where they live. And things like access to housing, access to stores, as Steve talked about, access to food matter. Now, all this sounds like so much common sense, but for some reason, when we organize our resources and our strategies, we want to pretend like individual interventions are enough. And they're just not. So Einstein had a quote, it was, everything should be made as simple as it can be, but no simpler. And my position today is, one of the reasons to focus locally is, it is necessarily complex to try and solve the problem of poverty and mobility. And the only way you're going to be able to do that well is to do it locally.
Okay, I just want to follow up there. You know, when you think about all the different potential investment strategies that you've got to invest locally, do you have a hierarchy? Are there strategies or systems that you would pick first to put that first dollar to or that next dollar to in terms of ROI for those outcomes?
So the reality is that it's highly contextual because it depends on where the needs are and where the assets and the momentum actually exist today. So the first thing to recognize is twofold. One is that if people have managed to navigate their way through the systems to the point where they can actually achieve some post-secondary education and a meaningful job, the likelihood that those people will then be able to support their kids is extremely high. And so though the returns in I'll call it economic senses, in investing in early childhood are very high, the ability to actually quickly have an impact on multiple generations is at the other end of the spectrum where you invest in people to get jobs, and then they can invest in their children. That said, the reality is that the compounding effects of, for example, unplanned pregnancy are multi-generational. A child born to, especially a low-income, but not exclusively a low-income parent in an unplanned way, that child has a higher likelihood of being low income for the rest of their lives, and it reduces the likelihood that that parent will ever escape as well. You look at communities like the state of Delaware, which has been able to dramatically reduce that in a matter of years. That's also another leverage point, and a scary one for some people.
Thank you. Andrea, I want to turn to you, the Executive Director of Propeller in New Orleans, and I want to ask you about, your work sort of started locally. It is based in a specific place, and you've kind of adjusted your lens over time in terms of how you do the work to have a more explicit racial equity focus, which I think is an interesting and important lens to add, and particularly in a city like New Orleans. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about why you made that shift and how it fits in with your work and how those two kind of layers of geography and race intersect.
So I would say that racial equity is the work, and it is the racial justice is the impact that we all are trying to make. And so it goes a lot with what Stephen was saying earlier about the design of the system. Well, my position is that when we look at disparities across every single system, and I don't think people would really argue too much about this, whether you're looking at health, early childhood education, housing, economic mobility, we find the same disparities across every single system, and I challenge anybody to give me one system where that is not the case, where everything is breaking down along racial lines, with whites at the top, Asians and Hispanics as a buffer class, and African Americans at the bottom. And so we see that replicated across all the different systems. And when we talk about impact and impact investing, what are we not talking about if not addressing these disparities? And at the core of all of it, what we talk about really is that structural racism is in the groundwater that is feeding every single system. And so to have an incubator that is focused on social innovation, that is focused on addressing health disparities, education disparities, really, when we get to the root of it, it's structural racism. And so if we don't have a strong racial equity lens to our work, we're actually working against ourselves. And going back to Jim's point about how all of these factors are intersecting, and going to your question, Ruben, about like which one would you choose first? Well, the issue is that they're all a manifestation of the same thing, which is structural racism. And so when we put up so the choices that we often make in impact investing or philanthropy, where it's like choose this or choose that, well, really, that's, in my opinion, it's a little bit of a false choice, because really the thing that we're addressing at the core is the same thing across every single system. So that goes to the why. And then in terms of my work is in entrepreneurship, obviously. We run an incubator, we have accelerator programs, we have a fund, we have a co-working space. And going back to what Stephen was talking about, the design of these systems, I think the other part that's really important to acknowledge is that where we are now, there's so much history that has been part of the design to get to where we are now today. And a lot of the policies, a lot of the speakers were talking about the need for public policy. Well, a lot of the policies were put in place, and many of them seemed race neutral on the surface. So we can talk about the GI Bill, we can talk about Social Security, but they were racially exclusionary. And so even things that seem racially neutral on the face actually are not. And those impacts are being felt right now when we talk about the disparities in design of our capital system. Well, people of color in this country are thousands and thousands of dollars behind their white counterparts because of the policies that have been set up in the country. And so I'll just give one quick example of Social Security. So it was an intentional exclusion of domestics and farm workers, and that essentially left out about 80% of the African American population in the South who could not benefit from Social Security. So when you have that compounded over time, Stephen also talked about the monopoly game. Well, you've got people, communities of color that are starting years and years behind. And so how is that just, and how are we now addressing the bias that exists in the systems, because racial bias still exists in our current investing systems, and we know that. And also, how do we address our the past privileges that were not distributed evenly?
Thank you. And just as a follow-on, do you feel like, explicitly addressing structural racism through your work and thinking about investment work with that lens, is that a thing that everyone in your sort of world and in the impact investment world that you talk to has gravitated to and been comfortable with, or have you had to have some difficult conversations to get to that point?
We laugh because anyways. So I think that people are starting to gravitate towards that, and I think that is a really positive thing. And I don't know that there is enough acknowledgement of the historical, historical context. Because when we look at the way things are now, we tend to go to, why is this community impoverished? Why aren't people just need more training to get access to capital, more whatever, right? And yes, that's true, and we have to acknowledge the historical context. And so difficult conversations with people, yes. And
I don't get the sense you're afraid to have those difficult conversations. If anyone wants a difficult conversation, Andrew will be available after. So Rodney, turning to you, speaking of critiques of the impact space, you've done a lot of writing and thinking about what impact investment is and isn't doing, and have expressed, a concern that we might be replicating some of the historic mistakes of capitalism in the past. And that's been discussed a little bit on the stage today. I would love to hear kind of what you think can be done at the local level, and why that's an important scale to not make those mistakes. Why is that the right place to go when you want to design or build capital structures or investment opportunities that can avoid falling down that same path?
All right, so first of all, you made the mistake of having Stephen before us, and then pairing me up with Andrea. So
I've made so many mistakes, I can't.
So one thing I want to acknowledge too, for the first question you asked actually to Jim about the importance of local, particularly within the context that Andrea just pointed out in terms of where we are racially, right, and the conversations we're having. So at least in the U.S., when you think about this, by 2040, 2041 or what have you, we're going to be majority people of color. And actually, if you look at many of the communities, like for example, New Orleans, Baltimore, my hometown, Oakland, where I live today, those places actually look like what our country will look like moving forward. And so many of the sort of economic challenges and a number of systems that are interrelated, to Andrea's point, are, these communities are places where, for those of us who are looking at the national impact that Jim was talking about, you really have to reconcile what's happening locally, right? You have to see it because, quite frankly, with the country moving that direction, that might be the place, these communities and these leaders who are doing remarkable things, that's actually where we might be able to find some hope, right, and some clarity. In terms of the question around impact investing and this broader critique that I myself might offer, we're even in the conversation, we're talking about new capitalism, we're talking about impact, we're talking about innovation, and we're talking about inclusion. And so the questions I always ask are, what are we actually doing differently, right? So Stephen talked about systems change, and we've talked a lot today about like strategies and tools and vehicles, but actually, for example, when we were citing sort of like market fundamentalism earlier and sort of like the decades focus around that, there was a foundation of sort of intellectual thought. There was a foundation of like narrative shift that occurred at the same time. And so one of the things I think about in terms of impact investing is how much are we actually borrowing from the same things that we've done over and over? There was a wonderful question asked earlier from the first panel in terms of, what's the willingness, for example, to maybe accept less return on investment to actually get to the impact and inclusion and innovation that we're seeking? Are we in fact perpetuating the thinking that we must always optimize and maximize return on investment, right? Market return on investment in sort of mainstream impact investing. And so that's one question, right, that I like to pose. And then the other part of it is that when we really think about inclusion in particular, I like to think much more about equity, and the conversation about justice has come up quite a bit. But to me, equity is really a conversation about self-determination, it's about power, it's about who owns, who has decision-making ability. And so I think the opportunity for impact investing, if you can actually drive equity, you can actually have impact. I can't say the inverse is true, right? You can have we had a conversation about short-term and long-term, for example. And so if you have that sort of focus on short-term impact, you might achieve it. But are we going to have the longer-term goals of actually driving equity? If you focus on equity, you actually will have positive impact. And so those are some of the things I think about. And then when we look at some of the remarkable things, obviously the work that Andrea is doing is an example of this work. But I think about some of the things, just up the road in Boston, for example, like the Boston Impact Initiative, which is doing really remarkable work in terms of focusing in on the racial divide and wealth in Boston, in which the median wealth for African Americans is $8, right? Supreme racial disparities in wealth. And so you have to ask yourself, can you both reconcile with the historical and contemporary? We talked about redlining earlier. It's still happening today. It's not just in the past. It's happening right now, right? Can you reconcile with that level of exploitation, right? All these sort of things, and also optimize your return on investment at the same time? Because it seems like you're actually going to perpetuate the dynamic, right? So when Stephen was talking about opportunity zones, typically folks who are making impact investments already have wealth. So on one hand, you might be increasing your wealth, while at the same time trying to actually reconcile wealth inequality. right? And so it's sort of like this cognitive dissonance. And so these are kind of questions that we think about. And so looking at what you can do locally with the Boston Impact Initiative, for example, where you're fixated on a place, right? And when Stephen's talking about systems change, you actually shrink down. Deborah Fries, who founded Boston Impact Initiative, talks about this a lot. You can shrink down the systems that you're working on, these interdependent systems, and actually focus on a community that can then sort of deconstruct all of the challenges that are happening, leveraging opportunities for investment to be catalytic in terms of who owns and who has decision-making power.
In terms of, and just as a question for anyone on the panel who wants to pick it up, in terms of designing those approaches and thinking about local problems and then developing local solutions, are we doing a good enough job, and how can we do a better job, maybe, I'll answer my own question, bringing more voices to the table? What are some examples of that you've seen in your work, or places where you feel like we could be doing more to get more people involved in figuring out these solutions?
Well, just really quickly, I think part of it is when we talk about, and that's the difference to me between inclusion and equity, right? So I'm going to go back to Boston, think about our friend Aaron Tanaka and the work Boston Ujima Project. They're building their own table to bring others in. And by what I mean by that is a focus on local residents who have an opportunity to come together to think about where investment should go. And so investing in themselves and attracting other investors into it, but actually creating the container for them to actually have decision-making and not being invited by someone else, but actually creating that context for themselves.
I'll just throw in, I think, no, we're not doing a good enough job. And I think, I just quickly, three quick things. One is, in this audience, I think broadly we just need to recognize, we've talked a lot about compounding today. And so one of the challenges that we're going to have to wrestle with is, we all know that when you're trying to convince somebody to save, starting earlier is better. But what if somebody started 2 generations ago? Right? And so the question is, can you actually design a system that catches up and disrupts compounding math that is that extreme? The second question is, if you're going to disrupt it, you need to actually create something that doesn't exist today. And one of the things that is true is that what we've learned a lot about is human-centered design, that you design solutions around the needs of the people that you're trying to serve, and that their perspectives are the only way you're going to actually create something that's going to change fundamentally the way the job gets done. We don't do a good job of that. Most of the dollars that flow through traditional channels that look at traditional criteria and don't create the space for the kind of innovation that needs to happen to create truly radical solutions. Part of that is because we don't actually have the mechanisms to push the capital down to folks who actually need it in ways that we respect. Not that they don't exist, in ways that we respect. And so you have to take the leap of investing through channels that are proximate to the people who are going to come up with the solutions. And we haven't come up with a way to do that yet that we collectively, I'll call it validate. The last thing I'll say is that the pathway, the broken capital markets from for our local entrepreneurs who are solving local community problems to become scaled enterprises are broken as well. And so unless we actually start to think across the capital spectrum, not just about it came up earlier, not just about the types of concessionary capital, which we actually need to kill that word because there's real value in the impact that gets created. But we need to also think about how we bridge people to the different stages with folks who are prepared to recognize the value they're creating.
One of the things that comes up a lot in the impact space is measurement and metrics and what we're doing. And I think, at the local level, my question is, what should we be measuring? We don't have a lot of great examples of cities or locations in the United States that I think everyone would agree function equitably. In fact, in our greatest wealth-generating locations are also some of our least equitable locations. What should we take away as our North Star and be looking to as a that driving metric that we ought to be trying to move towards? Or am I oversimplifying the problem, and should we not speak in that language anymore? And if not, what should replace it?
I think measurement can be very useful, and I know that this is not going to solve the problem, but I think at a minimum, if we could get rid of the racial bias that currently exists in lending, that would make a huge difference. So I don't know if you can call that impact, but to me, that's huge impact, just by taking out racial bias. And that's nothing about concessionary or what, that's just fair is fair. You know, when you're looking at someone on every credit worthiness measure, that everyone gets a level playing field just on that across. So if you're going to measure the health of the community and its capital and people's access to capital, just take out racial bias would be one.
So the U.S. Partnership for Mobility came up with the framework. It actually is pretty broad. I would just point people towards it since we got a minute left. What I would say is that it doesn't actually take into consideration wealth creation. And the other thing that we actually need to do that actually came up in this conversation is we have to plan for inclusive growth, both community-wise and individually. And what I mean by that is that, take the Opportunity Zone example, the way it is structured today, it will draw in capital without a design for how you actually let the current residents benefit going forward. And that's been, frankly, the history of low-income housing development in this country. The only way that happens is outside of the capital structure, there's a deliberate planning process that probably is a 2-decade-long plan for how you actually build communities that are highly integrated economically and deal with the fact that you're going to have to create both economic and political incentives to do that.
So, you want the last word here, Rodney?
Well, I'm sorry for that, but so one last thing I would say, and it just goes back to what Jim pointed out. Excellent question, right? And what are the opportunities to actually ensure that those of us here are not actually always determining what the metrics are, right? So how do we ensure that there's a human-centered design? Are you including for individuals who are directly impacted, communities that are directly impacted? Because again, I think that could be sort of a little bait and switch, or sort of a perpetuation in which investor class institutions that have much more privilege are actually creating the metrics and terms for what success looks like. So I just want to make sure that this is an opportunity in which we can actually include folks that are actually directly impacted to kind of come up with those metrics.
All right, I think that's a great place to end. Please join me in thanking these fantastic panelists.